Hi everyone, welcome to our show. My name is Curtis Brooks. This is Entrepreneurship, episode number 21. A very pleasant, happy new year to you on this third day of January, being the first week of the new year. And we are absolutely excited, or at least I am. But I wanted to talk about on today, the title of our show is Be Good to Yourself. I think that so many of us are in need of it. So many of us are in need of it, and wow, one-man show, trying to do all this stuff together here. I forgot my microphone here, but nevertheless, I think so many of us are in need of knowing how to be good to ourselves, and we miss it. We miss it on so many different levels because we think being good to ourselves means that we need to be good to someone else. And that's absolutely important first, but we have to learn how to be good to ourselves first. We must learn how to be good to ourselves. So again, the title of our show on today is Be Good to Yourself. We're going to talk about 3 points that I wrote on my little card here. And first, you must establish guidelines. Prior to the show, I was talking with a friend of mine and we were talking about guidelines, and I told her the title of the show, and I said, well, the title of the show is really what we're talking about. Our conversation was being good to yourself, and being good to yourself means that you and we have to establish guidelines. And the first guideline you want to establish is me time. Me time is absolutely essential. I don't care if you have a girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, or if you have a boyfriend and a husband and whatever the case might be. Me time is absolutely essential, guys. We sometimes think that, oh, well, we can just do life as we want. And that's true to some extent, but try doing life without guidelines. Try doing life without setting some parameters. And because so often we don't set those parameters, if you will, by the way of guidelines, I'm trying to look at my show here so I can see any kind of notes that are coming up here or questions. But again, because we don't see any kind of, or we don't set any kind of guidelines, we have a tendency to let's see if I can share this, to just kind of be all over the place, if you will. And because of that, I'm trying to set this show here, because we're all over the place, we are just missing it. We essentially are spread too thin. And because we're spread too thin, we find ourselves being less effective, unable to influence anything, let alone our own children. And that's another job in itself. That's another show in itself. But again, my point is that, one, you have to establish guidelines. That's the first point. And part of establishing guidelines is having some me time. Me time is absolutely essential. And I'm a parent too. I know how difficult it is raising children. I only have one child, but nevertheless, that is difficult. It can be difficult. It can be challenging, let alone learning how to manage ourselves. That can be just as difficult. But imagining ourselves, we have to set parameters. Parameters are absolutely essential. Children are asking for this. The spouse, the boyfriend, the girlfriend are asking for all kinds of things, to the point where we find ourselves just all over the place. Again, spread too thin, not able to be influential, not able to influence anything. And that is another piece of this in itself, because matter of fact, there's a book entitled The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and it's written by Stephen R. Covey. and he is no longer with us. He's since passed, but he is an exceptional gentleman. I don't know him personally, but I did have an opportunity to listen to several of his conferences on YouTube. But an exceptional gentleman, and he was a true blessing to me. I absolutely loved his book. Matter of fact, I have his book here in my library, and I actually have his audio book on my iPad there. Again, it's Seven Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen R. Covey. And in his book, he talks about the circles of influence. And there are things that we can influence and things that we cannot influence. But in being spread too thin, we are often trying to be influential in all kinds of different matters. We're, again, essentially spread too thin. And being spread too thin, we're not influential, to say the least. We're not going to be able to balance everything. And eventually, I like to say it, is that eventually the mind breaks down. And the truth of the matter is, there's not much we can do with a broken mind. And man, this title of the show was not necessary because this is a new year. It's not because we need a New Year's resolution. But the title of the show is about just being good to yourself, regardless of it being the very first week of this new year, regardless of what tomorrow may bring, or what even 2 minutes or 30 minutes from now will bring. It's about being good to yourself. It's about making the necessary changes that will allow you to be good to yourself. We talked about establishing guidelines, me time, having a plan. And there's nothing like having me time. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But even without a plan, me time becomes almost, or essentially, it can be, or at least appear to be, selfish time. So we can have sometimes that tendency to go too far to the left, too far to the right. That is the reason why we set guidelines. Because we don't want to go from one extreme to the other. We want to hang out in the middle, knowing that me time is absolutely wonderful, but we still have responsibilities, be it to your kids, your spouse, and other individuals who are in your life, your job, to make sure that payments are paid on time, bills, or whatever the case may be. We still have responsibilities and obligations. So it is important to have me time. First, it's important to understand that setting guidelines is absolutely essential to being good to yourself. Absolutely essential. And having me time is important. That's kind of just a known. You absolutely, well, maybe not for everyone, but I'm telling you now, you need to have me time. You absolutely have to have me time. But nevertheless, establishing guidelines, having me time, absolutely essential. And in having me time, we don't want to go too far to the right or to the left. So that's the reason why it's so important to have a plan as you have established certain guidelines. One being the me time. Maybe take 2 hours or an hour, half hour, whatever the case might be. I know and understand that our schedules as parents, as professionals, as individuals, I understand that it gets absolutely ridiculous sometimes. It gets super busy. There's mouths to feed, there's bills to pay, and all of these different responsibilities and obligations to take care of. I absolutely get it. I understand. I'm one of them as well. But I've learned that in the midst of everything that's going on, you have to establish guidelines. It is important, absolutely essential, to draw the line in the sand, if you will, and say, hey, you know what? I have ran my limit. So as you have established those guidelines, recognizing that you ran your limit, you've got to have a plan. You must have a plan, because without a plan, that me time can go too far to the left or to the right. It can end up being selfish time, if you will, and ignoring those responsibilities and obligations that we all have in life as adults and even as young people. So there are responsibilities and obligations that we all have. So in me time, it is absolutely important to recognize that it is essential. Create a list or agenda as you are establishing guidelines. And we're talking about being good to yourself. That's what we're talking about. So this is how we learn how to be good to ourselves. Establishing guidelines, me time, creating a plan or having a plan, how you're going to spend your me time. 2 hours, maybe just doing nothing, if that's possible. 2 hours in a space, or 5 minutes meditating. The other hour and 55 minutes reading a book. Doing something where it relaxes you. Finding your peace. Because the problem comes or happens so often that we are, in fact, in search of peace. That's what we're in search of, guys. We need peace. And the only way that you're going to find your peace is that you go after it. You have to go after it. And recognize that our busyness can essentially keep us away from finding peace. So it has to be something that you and I will do, that is to go after our peace, so that we can think clearly, we can hear clearly, and we can move forward with life's plans, responsibilities, and obligations. Too many responsibilities, too many obligations. It keeps us away from finding peace. Too many distractions. It keeps us away from finding peace. Well, you may say, Curtis, my kids are not a distraction. No, they're not. But sometimes the things that they do are a distraction. My kids aren't this. Well, if your kids aren't, then someone else's kids are. And my point is that our kids, if not a distraction to us, they're a distraction to someone else. And if it's not our kids, it's someone else's kids who are a distraction to us. So it becomes absolutely essential that we recognize that the very children that we've given birth to can be a distraction. Again, not so much and the children themselves are a distraction, but the things that they do, the things that we sometimes as parents forget to monitor, if you will, forget to put those guidelines on. And when we forget to place guidelines on our children, they in turn ignore any other future guidelines that we might try to establish within our own right, if you will. They'll bulldoze over those guidelines. And if not the children, the spouse will. So it becomes absolutely essential that we establish guidelines, guys. We're talking about being good to yourself. Be good to yourself. All right? Talked about creating a list, an agenda. Being good to yourself. Here's the thing, guys. You cannot be good to anyone else if you have not taken care of you. All too often, we are jumping over hoops and loops and different things to make sure that we're taking care of other people. But in turn, we're not taken care of. And we end up giving someone else that responsibility to take care of us, when in fact, it is our responsibility to be able to take care of ourselves. And it's important for us to understand that, because in most cases, here's what it's like. Let me create this scene here. It's like someone carrying 5 pounds or 15 pounds of potatoes. This person wants to prepare this meal or this feast of a meal for their family. And they're carrying 15 pounds of potatoes. You haven't thought about a feast. You have no idea or don't care about a feast, but the other individual wants to prepare a feast for their family. So they're trying to figure out how to carry these 15 pounds of potatoes to eventually prepare for this feast. You see that the person is struggling, but do you recognize that the person is struggling? Or does the person make all kinds of noises to let you know that they are struggling? And what do in most cases? We try to find a way to help the person out. Well, let me give you a hand in carrying these potatoes. And then truly, it's possibly can be thought of as a good Samaritan, you being a good Samaritan, helping the individual carry the potatoes. But even at a deeper look at this situation, is it your responsibility? This person wants to have a feast for their family. And I know it's simple in its nature, if you will, but, or at least the description, the scenery, the scene that I've put together, I understand that it's simple, but the point of it is that life, a lot of things that we have taken on ends up being someone else's responsibility. And we find a way to help this person out. We find a way to try and be there and give as much attention to the individual as possible, because we want to help them prepare a feast, want to help them create whatever they're trying to build, or whatever the case may be. But here's the thing. We first must learn how to take care of ourselves. And in that scene that I just shared with you, most cases, if the roles were reversed, where we're now carrying those 15 pounds of potatoes in preparation for this huge feast for our family, we would in turn expect the other person to help us out because we helped them. But here's the truth. That is our responsibility. And yes, we're only talking about potatoes, but let's make this even bigger. What about our own certain or different responsibilities in life? How we have placed certain agendas, if you will. And I mentioned about creating a list, an agenda, how important it is in establishing guidelines. It's just as the same as we've created a list with the notion of fulfilling or at least accomplishing all the items on this list or the agenda. And here we are having issues or difficulties in creating this list or accomplishing these different items on the list here. And we now are trying to dump that responsibility off onto someone else. And now it becomes their list. And if it doesn't get done, we end up getting mad at them or upset with them. We're still talking about being good to yourself. Being good to yourself means taking absolute responsibility. Being good to yourself means that knowing that there are certain things that I am in control of. Recognizing those things. We're not in control of how someone feels about us. We're not in control of someone else's behavior. Perhaps it's their thought that if we don't give them what they're asking for, and they get upset with us, now we're upset because they're upset. That's not your responsibility. That's their problem. My mom would say to me when I was much younger, she would say to me, Curtis, you have to know and understand that your situation, whatever you're going through, it does not constitute an emergency for me. Something to think about. And that also goes with our children. It goes with our spouse. It's about individual responsibility. That's what it's about. And so often, as again, back to the scene that I spoke of earlier, the person carrying the 15 pounds of potatoes and need of help, or at least making all these sounds, moans and groans and all this noise here, and we feel compelled to help the person. Some of us may or may not, but nevertheless, possibly we feel compelled to help this person. Is it not in the same fashion that if we had a list of items that we are to accomplish, and now we're handing someone else that list because we're feeling or believing that it is too difficult to accomplish the items on this list. And now it becomes their responsibility. And if the list doesn't get completed, we get upset with the individual because they didn't complete the list. When in fact, everything that's on this list are the things that we want to do or we believe that needs to be done. It in fact is our responsibility. Think about it, guys. How often we are placing major responsibilities and they don't become major until years later, because essentially it becomes something small that we've given away and yet something smaller, and eventually we've given the entire field away. Because we sometimes in life think that it's going to happen so big, it's going to be one person say, hey, give it to me. But no, we end up giving it away. One small responsibility at a time. We end up giving it away to the point where we end up being responsible for nothing because we've given it away. We've taken full advantage or to complete extreme of this me time, if you will, as I mentioned earlier. Too far to the left, too far to the right. So it is absolutely essential that we establish guidelines and know that guidelines and parameters are absolutely important. Without those guidelines, without those parameters, without that fence, if you will, things are subject to fall outside of the guidelines. And we are finding ourselves having to bring certain things back into the parameters that we've set up. When in fact, the guidelines have been established of knowing what we can handle. There will come an opportunity, and life will always present opportunities to us that will enlarge us and enlarge our responsibility on what we can handle. Be it a promotion, be it another child. Personal goals are set or completed. Professional goals are set and completed. So there will be opportunities for us to expand our responsibility. But it first comes in a way of learning how to be good to ourselves. The expansion does not come without a price. A lot of times, most of us, not all, but we want the responsibility. We want the big houses, the cars, the different things, and the toys, the gadgets, the computers, and all these different things. But expansion comes with a price. It's learning how to be good to yourself. So that's what we were talking about. Learning how to be good to yourself. Part of our second piece here is, I mentioned taking responsibility. And taking responsibility, we have to learn how to not assume and communicate effectively. My mom would say to me as a youngster, Curtis, do you know what happens when you assume? You make a ASS out of you and me. So assumption is, it can lead us into bad places. It can lead us into thinking we know what the other person is thinking about. It can lead us into eventually dead ends, if you will. Poor communication. Again, assuming that we know what the other person's thinking. And in fact, we don't know what they're thinking. So learning not to assume and thinking we know what people are saying, but communicating effectively, knowing how we feel and being able to communicate those things. One of the last things that we're going to talk about as we wrap it up here, we've got about 3 minutes here, is finally we must know our limits. We must absolutely know our limits. And the friend of mine that I spoke to earlier, she mentioned about a elevator or something of that sort, and I don't know if it was an elevator, but the point of it is that if you have an object, its capacity is 1,300 pounds. And it's been tested, it's been proven that, hey, this item here can only hold up to 1,300 pounds. And you run into serious error or some challenges or difficulties that could transpire if it's over its limit. And back to our situation, learning to be good to ourselves, is that we too must know that we have limits. We must know our limits, much in the same sense of that elevator or that container that can only hold 1,300 pounds. It's absolutely essential. It becomes absolutely essential that we adhere to the instructions that are listed. Likewise, in the same way with us, it becomes absolutely essential that we adhere to the instructions that are on our heart, on the tablets of our heart. Meaning that we've dealt with certain things in life and we've come to a place where, hey, you know what? I'm comfortable with being able to say that I can handle this. I can handle this and I can handle this, but I'm not okay with handling this. Whatever that may be. I can handle A, I can handle B, but I cannot take on C and D. This is about setting guidelines. This is about knowing your limits. And most importantly, it's about being good to yourself. We think sometimes that being good to ourselves is being good to others. And that's absolutely true. But as we wrap it up here, you cannot, and I say this with every conviction in my heart, You cannot be good to someone else if you have not learned how to be good to yourself. It is absolutely impossible. It is absolutely impossible. Because if you have not been able to or have identified with being good to yourself, if you have not been able to identify with learning how to set guidelines, establish guidelines, me time, as I mentioned on the list here, creating a plan, creating a list or an agenda to get certain things done, take care of responsibilities and obligations. If you have not learned how to do that, you have not been good to yourself. Because before anyone else comes into your life, even to be your children, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, you and I must learn how to take care of ourselves. We must have an example of good. In most cases, we don't know, or we have no example of what good is. And we end up, as I mentioned earlier, falling outside of any kind of parameter that we may have established, or altogether not having or had established any kind of parameters or guidelines, but just all over the place. When in fact, the only way for you and I to hit the target is that we are clear on our objective, that we have a plan to accomplish the list or our agenda, our goals. That's being good to yourself. Being good to yourself means that you are taking care of yourself. You come first. And let me explain that. In a sense that you have to take care of yourself first. I've told this story, as I'm going to wrap it up here, about a couple minutes over. I told this story several times to different friends and former clients, that I had an English teacher, Miss Gibson, and it was around the time, it's been years ago now, but it was around the time where they had that fundraiser out Feeding Africa, Save the World, or something of that sort. Michael Jackson and a bunch of other pop celebrities and actors as well. In any event, they had this campaign going on about feeding Africa, and I wanted to get so involved in it. I wanted for our school to get involved in it, but I didn't know how to go about it. And I went to my teacher, Miss Gibson, and I would love to see her again. It's been many years now. I'm gotten to be an old man now, but nevertheless, it's been many years. But I went to Miss Gibson and I said, Miss Gibson, I would love to be able to be involved in this. How can we get involved in this? Maybe bring canned goods or food in, to the school, that we can put boxes together and have it shipped to Africa to feed the people in Africa, different villages. And I thought it was such a great idea. She said to me, and you may have heard me mention this before in one of my other shows here. She said to me, Curtis, and that was the longest pause, or at least that's what I believe. It was the longest pause in my life. And she said to me, Curtis, you first have to take care of yourself. And my response was a pause. I paused as well, and I said, well, is that a yes or a no? I actually didn't say that, but that's what I wanted to say, because I didn't understand. But now I understand. And if I could see her again, I'd give her a big kiss on her cheek, because I understand now. You first have to take care of yourself. And when we learn how to be good to ourselves, out of the abundance, out of the excess that's been given to us, again, talking about that expansion, learning how to expand in our own place that we're in, this position that we're in. We're thinking sometimes that we need to be here, we need to be here, and be everywhere. But in fact, if we take a stand everything that we could hope for, desire, comes to us. We must know and understand that life is not going to void us of the responsibility. The responsibilities are there, the obligations are there, and there are plenty. But we must set guidelines. We must know our limits. And in knowing our limits, it doesn't mean that we can't grow. But it first becomes about being good to yourself. That's what this show is about. Learning how to be good to yourself. This is not a New Year's resolution. This is something that we all must resolve to do. Is first, learn how to be good to yourself. And out of the abundance, the excess that you have to share, that you now have to share, you can be good to others. But without that understanding, it's impossible to be good to someone else, because you and I, with not being able to be good to ourselves, or at least understanding how to be good to ourselves, we can identify with being good. We're, in fact, taken for granted. We're pulled in many different directions. So, again, be good to yourself, guys. It's not a New Year's resolution. It's something that we all are striving to accomplish. Make that priority on your list, on your agenda. Be good to yourself. Guys, my name is Curtis Brooks, and I am 7 minutes over my time. Wow, this gets good. In any event, we do our show each Tuesday and Thursday here on Facebook Live on our page here. That is Curtis Brooks, Transformational Speaker / Coach. We actually have started a mastermind group, and as I wrap it up here, again, I know I'm over time here, but as I wrap it up here, we started a mastermind group. It's called Mythbuster Mastermind Group here on Facebook, and I invite you guys to check it out. I invite you guys to be a part of the group. It is for now a public group, and eventually the group will be closed, because as the group grows, there will be some personal things that we don't want the world to see or hear. We are going to be a family. This is about you and I removing those stories, or getting rid of those stories, those old wise tales, those myths that have so much cluttered our minds. So our Mythbuster Mastermind Group, I'm actually going to be changing some things up here. Again, typically I've been doing my show each Tuesday and Thursday from 11 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Central Standard Time. I want to dedicate some time also to Mythbuster. So that being said, more than likely, starting this week, actually, the new year out, I will be doing a Facebook Live event for Mythbuster Mastermind Group. And that's going to be at 11 o'clock on Thursday to 11:30 a.m. Central Time on Thursday. Again, starting on Thursday, which is a couple of days here, doing our Mythbuster Mastermind, and that it will be on Thursday from 11 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. We'll be in the Mythbuster Mastermind Group. Kind of a tongue twister there. We'll be in the Mythbuster Mastermind Group doing our Facebook Live. Till then, guys, we want to thank you and appreciate you guys for being a part of this show here. That is the Entrepreneurship Show here at our 21st episode. Guys, thank you. Have a great day. We'll see you on Thursday in our Mythbuster Mastermind Group at 11 a.m. Central Time. Ciao.